Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The Workers' Party of Britain live online meeting with George Galloway, and afterwards we'll be having a Q&A. This week we're discussing the question of Palestine and where we stand on the issue. So without further ado, George Galloway.
And friends, comrades of the Workers' Party, whom I address every Tuesday evening at this time, for the purposes of deepening the knowledge of our members about the great issues of the day. Last week was Ireland. The previous meeting was on the Victory Day, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the defeat of fascism in the rubble of Berlin. And we have discussed many other issues too, but we thought it was time, as we coincide with the Nakba Day, the commemoration of what the Palestinians call the catastrophe. That's what Nakba means, the catastrophe, when their country was effectively wiped from the face of the map, and when their people were driven out, 800,000 Palestinians driven out of their homes, their villages, their land, never to return, at least until this point. There are two things I need to say right at the beginning, because I expect there will be a much larger than normal non-party audience for this particular meeting. Most of them will be well-wishers, but some will be ill-wishers. And so I want to make this point very clear at the beginning, that many Jews are not Zionists, a very significant number, either because they religiously reject the idea of the state of Israel, and those number many hundreds of thousands, and they all have big families, so that number is only going to grow as a proportion of the Jewish population in the world, or because they are leftist, socialist, communist, secular Jews who reject the idea that anything like Israel can clearly claim to be a Jewish state, a state for all the Jews in the world. They say, include me out of that. So many Jews are not Zionists, and most Zionists are not Jews, an equally important point to make. As I used to joke, anyone who thinks George W. Bush loved Jews should take a look at his golf club in Texas, where no Jew was in membership. And of course, some of the worst anti-Semites in the world are strong supporters of the state of Israel. Literal fascists are supporters of the state of Israel and have no problem at all declaring themselves Zionists. And of course, this stretches back into history. The reason that Mr. Balfour secretly, but not secret to his intimates, gave for signing the Balfour Declaration was that he and his like hoped that it would lead to them never having to look upon any Jew in England thereafter. And there are lots of examples, some of them too painful to explore in the context of an address like this, but they are nonetheless historically absolutely undeniable, that some of the people who hated Jews the most loved the idea of Israel the most. And so bear in mind that whatever I'm going to say this evening has absolutely nothing to do with animus towards the Jewish religion, faith, or Jews as individuals or as a collective people. The opponent that I have fought all of my life almost is Zionism, not Judaism, not Jewish people. And in fact, some of the greatest fighters for Palestinian rights in Britain, in the Labour Party, and in the world have themselves been Jewish. And some of the worst scoundrels who have defended the state of Israel and its many crimes over a long period of time have been themselves anti-Semitic. Now, I have sat in the room where Mr. Balfour signed the Balfour Declaration and began a process, a descent down a blood-spattered staircase, which has led us to the current pass, to which I shall come later in my address. I've also sat in the room where Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, the Foreign Office officials of both Britain and France, with their maps and their slide rules and their pencils, drew the imperialist map of the Middle East, handing countries, peoples, territories to one or other of the victorious imperial powers. And the two things cannot be separated. And they are the reason why someone like me, someone like many of you, have devoted what might be seen to be inordinate time to work in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Because, first of all, it is a British-created problem. We are the authors of the Palestinian people's indignity, their suffering, unending suffering over 100 years or more. This is a problem that we created, that we facilitated when we were the imperial power in the Arab Middle East. And the second associated reason is that the Palestinian question cannot be separated from imperial conquest, colonialism. One of the reasons why it goes without saying that if you're interested in fighting for justice for Palestine, you really should be in the Workers' Party. For sure, you cannot possibly stay in the Labour Party, because the Labour Party has literally made illegal what I have just said. What I have just said is that the creation of Israel and the destruction of the Palestinian people was an imperialist, colonialist project. Because colonialism cannot be separated from racism. How could it be? What's the only justification for colonial ownership and occupation of someone else's land many thousands of miles away from your own land other than racism? The racist idea that some people are better than other people, that some people need their betters to hold their hand on the long, long, long walk to independence and sovereignty, or not at all to emerge from colonial occupation. Therefore, Israel is a racist endeavor, and that would get you expelled from the Labour Party if you said it, which is why on this anniversary week of the Nakba, virtually no one in the Labour Party has tweeted to that effect. Think about it. Rack your brains for all those that used to speak out against this racist endeavor, this colonialist project, who have strangely fallen silent. Well, of course, it isn't strange, because if they did, the unit inside the Labour Party that appears still to be working, burning the midnight oil every night, would hunt them down and suspend before expelling them from Labour Party membership. Now, you can put up with that if you will. You may think that Keir Starmer is worth it. I certainly don't, and all the evidence from the Workers' Party, the fastest growing political organisation in Britain, by a long chalk, I imagine, is receiving a steady stream, a rush actually, of people who, because they will not be silenced on this key issue of imperialism and colonialism, can no longer stomach remaining in Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party. So that's the reason why it's our business. First of all, the crime was committed by our country, our government, our state, and secondly, because it was sustained, and this whole disaster has been because of our role as a state, as first the premier imperialist power in the region, and secondly, thereafter, later, after the withdrawal from Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel, as the auxiliary of the increasingly dominant, now absolutely super dominant imperial power, the United States of America. It does not mean that Palestine is the most egregious of all the empire's crimes. It isn't. Not in quantity, certainly. There are many other imperialist crimes, even in the Middle East, that have killed far more people, created even more misery. But they were not our creation, and they are not so significantly linked to imperialism and colonialism. It is the case that Palestine, for all that it has suffered, and the uniqueness of it, as I always say, it was the only example, even in imperial history, when one power gave to a second power, namely the Zionist movement, the land belonging to a third power before we even possessed it as an imperial possession, because that was the case when Balfour made his declaration. One people promising a second people the land of a third people. That's unique. But Palestine is not under Nazi rule. Israel is not a fascist state. The Palestinian people are not being put into death camps. Except for Gaza, which I shall come back to, these comparisons are odious and should not be made. For all the crimes that Israel has committed, and they are many, the Palestinian people are not suffering a systematic, industrialized attempt to annihilate them. They are suffering a systematic, industrialized attempt to get rid of them, to clear them off their land, the remaining slivers of Palestinian land that they have clung to ever since this catastrophe. The 800,000 who have now become 12 or 13, 14 million Palestinians who live in exile mainly live lives of utter wretchedness and ruin in refugee camps, so rancid, I wouldn't wish a visit to them upon any of you. I have myself spent far too long and far too many hours, days, weeks in them, even for a short time, 40 years ago, briefly living in one of them. So it's because of these unique things, because of these significant connections to us, that we have a special duty to stand up for the Palestinian people. Their lives, as most of you will know in outline, have now for 4 generations been utterly destroyed. One of the reasons why I have been in this cause since 1975, which is a very long time ago indeed, is that by 1977, this ceased to be an abstract matter for me. It ceased to be harrowing pictures on a page because I visited the Palestinians in their camps in Lebanon in 1977, and I made promises there. And I don't make promises easily, and I try very hard to keep my promises. And the promise I made in 1977 was that I would spend the rest of my life fighting for justice for them. And even my worst enemies, including those watching, would have to concede that that is what I have done. I can't say it's been a pleasure. It's been very far from a pleasure. I knew when I made the stand for the Palestinian people that I was in the process making very powerful enemies, enemies that would stop at nothing to wreak revenge for any good that I would try to do. What I did not calculate in my callow youth, aged 23, was that whilst I would have powerful and vindictive enemies as a result, that I would have such faithless friends, such friends who would increasingly over the decades disappear. And when the vindictive enemy came to wreak its revenge, that so many of these faithless friends would fall silent and melt away. But that has not affected my determination, because the promise I gave was not to any particular Palestinian or any Palestinian organization or leader. The promise that I gave in 1977 was to the suffering Palestinian masses in their camps. And as long as they continue to suffer and to be denied elementary justice, even a school or a clinic or a diet that can keep them healthy, my promise has not yet run its course. The Palestinian people have been scattered to the four corners of the earth, while most of them live nearby in camps, and some of them in camps from the bars of which, through the wire of which, they can, in some cases, see their own homes. In Gaza, for example, which even David Cameron described as the largest open-air prison camp in the world, and he was not exaggerating, though he never repeated those words, some 2+ million people live in a tiny strip of virtually desertified land from which there is no escape, no entrance, no exit, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and yet subjected to absolutely merciless siege and bombardment, decade after decade after decade, with no one raising a finger and increasingly not even raising a voice in their defense. From Gaza, you can see where now stand shining Israeli cities which are built on, literally built on, the bones and the ruins of the Palestinian villages which were once occupied by the families of the refugees looking through the barbed wire in Gaza, in Jenin in the West Bank. If you climb to the highest point of the camp, you can literally see the orchards and the fruits being picked by foreigners who already had homes in New York, in London, in other parts of the world are now picking the fruits of people whose fruits they are, whose trees they are, whose land it is, but who are incarcerated as refugees inside their own country, looking at their own property which has been stolen from them decade after decade, wave after wave of Palestinians have been forced to flee and to disperse. And when I say four corners of the world, I literally mean it. I once gave a speech in a place called Yellowknife, which is on the Arctic Circle in Canada. And the people organizing the meeting had organized a photo opportunity for me to go ice fishing on the Great Slave Lake, where the ice was 9 feet thick. And as I approached the fishing hole, which had been drilled for me, I saw that the little girl who was to hand me the fishing rod certainly didn't look local. And when I asked her where she was from, she answered, Haifa. I'm from Haifa in Palestine. Now, of course, she had never seen Haifa. Her parents probably neither. Her grandparents, though, had lived and loved and had a wonderful life in a beautiful place on the sea called Haifa, from which they had all been driven. And this was the northernmost Palestinian refugee family that I ever came upon. But very few of you will not actually have met any Palestinian either here in Britain or in your travels around the world. Palestinians have no papers, no passports, no status. They are shunted from place to place, held at every airport, held at every border. And as I often say, the injury that has been added, the insult that has been added to the injury that these people have suffered is that for many people, they, the victims of terrorism, are called the terrorists, while those who actually were the terrorists are called the victims of terrorism. All the Palestinians demand is the right to return to their own land, their own houses. And this is their right under international law, inalienable right, as the law puts it, meaning a right that can never be taken away from you by anyone. Some of you may recall when Tony Blair toured the Kosovan refugee camps, hastily set up in the middle of the Yugoslav war that Tony Blair and Bill Clinton did so much to inflame and turned into a disaster for all the peoples of Yugoslavia. When they were chanting, Tony, Tony, as Mr. Blair walked through the camp, he gave a speech and he said, these refugees have the right to return to their homes. And that right will exist however long they are kept here in these refugee camps. He actually said that. I think it's in my Tony Blair film, The Killings of Tony Blair. And of course he was right about that. Every refugee has the right to return to their home. And yet the Palestinian refugee is criminalized for even calling for the recognition of that right to return. And Labour has made it an offence against being a member of the party to demand that the Palestinian refugees have the right to return to their homeland. Now, right at the beginning, the Zionist leaders who persuaded Mr. Balfour to make his infamous declaration promised the British Empire that if they supported the creation of the State of Israel, it would be like a little loyal Ulster for the British Empire in the Middle East. And that was one of its most significant attractions. Because if European colonial settlers could be implanted as the planters in Ulster were implanted amongst the colonized, subjugated Irish people, amongst the subjugated, colonized Arabs in the Middle East, then Britain and its empire would have achieved a significant gain, a little loyal Ulster. And that's one of the reasons why we did what we did. And if that was true then, imagine how true now and later it became for the American empire, which took over the role and responsibilities of the leading imperial power in the post-Second World War order. Israel, as Joe Biden said in a speech which recently emerged, back in the 1980s, the early 1980s, he said, and I'm quoting him directly, "If Israel didn't exist, the United States would have to invent it." That's what the man who's hoping to be the next president of the United States told the American Senate, and for once he was telling the truth. Because in making the State of Israel the military power that it is, right in the middle of the Middle East, the most strategically important real estate in the world, they were not getting a little loyal Ulster, they were getting a little loyal America. Israel does the bidding of America, not the other way around, as some conspiracy theorists often spin. Of course, the supporters of Israel are enormously powerful in the American political system, but most of them are not Jews. Most of them are, as a matter of fact, evangelical Christians who support Israel as the rope supports the hanging man. They support Israel to create the conditions for Armageddon, for Jesus to return, at which point all the Jews must convert to Christianity or be killed. How's that? For an example of supporting Zionism, but not just hating Jews, but looking forward to the mass conversion of them on the point of a sword, and if no conversion, then death. And this has been the role of Israel now for half a century, more than half a century. Now, of course, the Jews who've streamed in huge numbers to occupied Palestine after the Holocaust in particular, but for those who could escape even during the Holocaust, they were not the first Jews living in Palestine. There have always been religious Jews living in Palestine for thousands of years, living side by side and peacefully, harmoniously with their Christian and Muslim neighbors. As a matter of fact, the refugees who fled to Palestine as soon as they could, most of them didn't want to go to Palestine. Most of them wanted to go to the United States. Most of them wanted to go to Europe and Britain. But the very countries which supported Israel the most slammed shut the door the hardest against any significant incoming of European Jews, even when we knew what we knew as to the mass slaughter, the attempted genocide against Jewish people in the Second World War. And of course, that suited the Zionist leadership. They didn't want the Jews to go to America. They didn't want the Jews to come to Britain any more than the leaders of America and Britain wanted those Jews to come here. And so we have this conundrum about which Ken Livingstone famously fell, that Zionism and anti-Semitism became two sides of the same coin. Each believed that a French Jew was not French and would have divided loyalties and should go to live in Palestine on somebody else's land, should give up their homes in Europe, in America, and go and take someone else's home in Palestine. Think about the significance of that I have just said. Both the anti-Semite and the Zionist believe that Jews should not remain in the country in which they were born, in which their forefathers and mothers were born, for millennia, but should regard themselves as foreigners living in their own country and should leave to occupy someone else's land. That's why we say that Zionism equals racism, which for a long time was the extant policy of the United Nations, now deleted. But that's not the only reason why Zionism equals racism. And here I come up to date. You see, if you are not prepared, as they are not, as I said at the beginning, to physically annihilate the local Palestinian population en masse, all the millions of them, and if they are not prepared, despite everything that you do by siege and sanction, to get up and leave of their own volition, what is the Zionist state to do with the millions of Palestinian people? Equal population, by the way. Israel-Palestine has an equal population between Israelis and Palestinians, if you include the occupied territory, which of course you must, because these people are effectively living under Israeli rule, but without any rights at all, any legal or political or civil rights at all. But the population living under Mr. Netanyahu is 50-50 Israeli and Palestinian. So if you're not going to annihilate them and they won't leave, then the only thing that you can do is to institute a system of apartheid, whereby these people may live under our flag, our army, our government, but they will not be given the rights that Jewish citizens of Israel have, and that will last forever. What, if not apartheid, is that? And everyone knows, I don't have to labor this point. The systematic oppression of the Palestinian people living under occupation or annexation, or in the case of Gaza, permanent total siege. All of you know that. You don't have me to give you the chapter and verse. So how do we, on the outside, peacefully struggle to try to relieve the suffering of the Palestinian people, and try to change the balance of world opinion and therefore world political power, the only peaceful way that we can do it is the way that we did it against apartheid South Africa. Now, here I refer you to my speech in the Oxford Union. You'll find it easily enough. It's easily the biggest viewing figures of any speaker ever in the Oxford Union, in which I describe my own part in the struggle against apartheid South Africa, which included, in my case, even being present underground in apartheid South Africa, working for the African National Congress. Not many did that, but many millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions, knew that no decent, self-respecting person would buy the products, consume the services, go and visit, or treat normally the apartheid state of South Africa. And that's exactly how we must treat apartheid Israel. No decent person should buy their products or consume their services. No decent person should holiday there. No decent person should have normal intercourse and civil society relations there. We must boycott, we must divest, and we must demand sanctions. That will be a small contribution, not a big one. But as the ANC said after their historic victory, apartheid was smashed between the hammer of South African resistance and the anvil of international solidarity, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So I'm part of the anvil. So should you be. We're not fetishizing this subject. The Workers' Party is not the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We are mainly concerned with British politics in changing the nature of British government and of British society, but we are anti-imperialist, and we will side with the victims of imperialism, and we will oppose the imperialists wherever they are. Thanks for listening, Dan. I hope that was okay as an introduction to the subject. Can't hear you, Dan.
Apologies for the break there. Yeah, fantastic introduction. And we've got a few questions coming through. So the first question is coming from Helen. Let me just unmute you, Helen, and go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add my 2 pence, actually. It's mainly to do with the things that we post online and things like that. You know, when you post your videos of some child getting pinched off the street by men in uniforms and things like that. And in my experience, you tend to get people, you can get a barrage of abuse and people calling you anti-Semite and things like that. I was just going to say, I think the best thing is to not get drawn into, you know, they have no argument against what you've posted and things. They have no defense of it. So they'll try and, you know, they start talking about the Holocaust, or they talk about, I don't know, anti-Semitism, or they just try to drag you into arguments that are nothing to do with the with the actual situation. And you best bet. I mean, there's nothing to discuss. It's quite a simple thing. You know, I get frustrated when I see leaders, I mean, sometimes quite progressive leaders, saying, oh, we need to get round, we need to discuss, we're calling on them, you know, to cooperate and things. You're not going to get cooperation from Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, you know. They don't, it's like asking, it would be like asking the coronavirus to cooperate. They do what they do. They're psychopaths. I'm allowed to say that. You know, and don't be afraid to speak out against these people. You know.
Well, Helen, you've just demonstrated what the block button is for on Twitter. I caution everyone not to be drawn into debates with trolls who are there to drag you into interminable arguments in the hope, perhaps, that you will say something you shouldn't say, or something that they can twist out of context into something that will look wrong. Some of them are paid to do so, a significant number. There is an entire industry, a whole Hasbara industry in the state of Israel whose job is, I mean job, paid job, is to engage you in arguments on Twitter. So I caution all of you quickly to block them. And I just read a quote from Malcolm X. I'd retweeted it just before I started. I'm for justice, no matter who for or against. Maltreating children, shooting unarmed people, torture, siege, occupation are wrong. Whoever is doing them and whoever they're doing them against, they're wrong. When we cut the heads off Malayan people and carried them back to camp and got a bounty for every one, when we occupied Ireland and shot people down in the street, it was wrong. It was wrong for us, and it's wrong for Israel. And a significant number, a very significant number of Jewish people around the world, particularly young people, and particularly in America, are increasingly with us on that. And even a brave minority in Israel is with us on that. They are not numerically, statistically significant, but their moral strength is simply enormous. Trust me, I once upon a time knew a lot of these people, used to live with them in Shankin Street in Tel Aviv, not far from Dizengoff Square, where they were protesting with social distancing observed against Netanyahu just very recently. And in those days, I had a friend. Her name was Shulamit Aloni. She was a member of the Israeli parliament, an MK, and for a time she was a minister in the Israeli government. And one night she gave me dinner in her home in Tel Aviv. And she said to me, as she subsequently said on television, at least once, because the video exists, "It's a trick," she said. "We always do it." The trick was to accuse those who support the Palestinian cause of being anti-Semitic. It's a trick. We always do it. Just keep that in your mind as you're pressing the block button. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, George. And the next question we have comes from Matthew Burrows. If you'd like to go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, evening, George.
Evening, Matthew.
It's just a quick question, really. I've not I've been in Palestinian, not Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, Liverpool Friends of Palestine for a while, on and off through the years. And to be honest, I don't know why I've not said this very thing. Is Zionism an atheist movement? What are its roots? And it's simple as that, really.
It's a very good question. And just for the fear of going on too long, I didn't deal with it in my opening address. Zionism is absolutely a secular and atheistic movement. Almost all, more than 90% of its leaders and founders were atheists. They only later discovered God in order to pretend that God had promised them the Palestinian lands. A good measure of that is that these same leaders tried over and over again to persuade the British Empire to give them other territories on which to form their colony. And there are many of those. The Seychelles was one. They asked the British government to allow them to form Israel in the Seychelles. They did the same in Uganda and almost succeeded in persuading the British Empire to let them have their white European colonial state in Uganda. They tried to persuade the world powers to allow them to build their state of Israel in Patagonia, in the south of Argentina, in which case we would have had a different PLO in subsequent decades, a Patagonian Liberation Organization. And this demonstrates, as does the fact that all of them were explicitly atheist Jews, that this has nothing to do with religion. The very religious Jews are the people I spoke of earlier who reject Israel, who want nothing to do with it. The ultra-Orthodox Jews, the more orthodox they are, the more they are against the political movement called Zionism and the political state called Israel. Now, it doesn't need saying perhaps, but I'll say it anyway. Those that spent half a century opposing the political state of the USSR and the political leaders of the Soviet Communist Party cannot be accused of hating Russians. As a matter of fact, you could argue the opposite. They wanted to save the Russians from the political movement called communism and the political state called the USSR. Well, it's exactly the same here. We are opposed to the political movement of Zionism and its expression in the political formation of the state called Israel. And many Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews, agree with us. And if you think Benjamin Netanyahu is religious, you've got another idea of religion to me. No one could act in the way that Netanyahu and Gantz act and be sincerely, genuinely a believer in God. Thanks for that, Matthew.
Thanks, George. The next question comes from Nadia. Go ahead, Nadia.
I'm Mr. Galloway.
Hello. Hi, Nadia.
Hi. The path to morally righteous is a lonely one. There are very few and far between who walk it, and yet you walk it. With all the resistance and the loss of your so-called friends, how have you found the heart to keep fighting on for the oppressed?
Well, thank you. Because I'm not doing it for them. I'm a religious believer, as you know, I believe in the judgment day, and I hope that on the judgment day, my struggle for the righteous people of the world will weigh in my favor in the balance. And secondly, when I know someone, when someone to my face asks me to help them, and I promise to help them, I have no moral choice thereafter but to do so. I cannot turn my back or walk by on the other side of the road. I can't pretend to you that it would have been far better for me in my life if I never discovered the Palestinian issue. I promise you, that would be a big lie. I could show you my scars, and not just scars sustained at the hands of our enemies either. But I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for the people in the camps who asked me for my help and to whom I promised my help. Thank you, though.
Thanks, George. And we have a question from Sophie. Do we as a party support BDS, that's a boycott, divest and sanctions movement?
I think it's axiomatic that we do. I don't think it's in our program, but probably because it scarcely needed to be said. It doesn't say in our program that we oppose the Saudi Arabian assault on the poorest people in the world in their next door neighbor, Yemen. But it's axiomatic. It goes without saying. Our opposition to imperialism requires us to be with the oppressed and against the oppressor. And the peaceful, democratic way, perfectly legal way that we can do that in this country is BDS.
Thanks, George. And I'm actually going to ask a question myself this week. I just wanted to know what you thought of the two-state solution. To me, it seems like it's something that's not being observed or worked towards by Israel in any way. And what do you think of the nation-state law that was brought in by Israel recently?
Well, because I was very close for many decades to the late President Arafat, I supported the two-state solution or the two-state analysis that he championed. And because of my relations with him, I supported the Oslo Agreement, which was supposed to put that into effect. As a matter of fact, I wrote the resolution which passed both the Labour Party conference and the Trade Union Congress in 1982, which explicitly called for the creation of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, and afforded recognition to the Palestine Liberation Organization as the sole legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. Believe me, getting those resolutions through the Labour Party conference and the Trade Union Congress were amongst the hardest and most difficult struggles I have ever undertaken. And that was in 1982, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, with all the horrors of Sabra and Shatila and the massacres and so on. It was still an extremely difficult resolution to pass, but we passed it. But I have to tell you now that I regard the so-called two-state solution as dead. It's dead because Israel will not implement it. It's dead because the entire demography and topography of the parts of Palestine, 21% or so of Palestine that were supposed to be the Palestinian state, have been completely distorted, destroyed. There is no space, literally, for a Palestinian state, and Israel has no intention of allowing one. But there's a third reason why I no longer support it, and it's rather more controversial. The events, time has demonstrated to me that there is nothing different or special about the Palestinian leadership from the leadership of the tyrannies of the Arab world. The Palestinian leadership of a tiny non-state-led has been scarred by the very same corruption, petty criminality, suppression of opposition and dissent, and looting as the governments of virtually all of the Arab countries. So I'm not really going to give the remaining years of my life to keep Mahmoud Abbas and his crew in power in Palestine. I have always, since the 1970s, opposed the idea that the Jews living in Palestine had to return back to their countries of origin. I always supported the policy first developed by the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine and their leader, Naif Hawatmeh, that the people of Israel have gained national rights, just like the great-great-grandchildren of the white settlers in South Africa have gained national rights and must be regarded as South Africans, even though their great-grandparents arrived from England or Holland and seized the land. If you're born in Israel, you have national rights to live there. And so, for all these reasons, I believe the time has come to demand one state, one democratic state, where all the Jews, all the Muslims, and all the Christians live as equal citizens under the law, under the Constitution. Now, of course, there will be many in Israel who would not want to live there in those circumstances, but many would. And of course, there will be some Palestinians who would not want to return to their land in those circumstances, but most would. And so the final demography would not be easy at this stage to calibrate. But if the law and the Constitution recognize the equal rights of all citizens, I believe that that could be a successful country. I go back to South Africa. When Mandela was freed, the white leaders of what was called the Orange Free State asked Mandela if they could have the Orange Free State as a white state, separate from the new Republic of South Africa. And Mandela answered, "We don't believe in black states or white states. We believe in democratic states where white people and black people live as equal citizens under the law." And as in so many things, if that's right for a post-apartheid South Africa, it's right for post-apartheid Israel-Palestine.
Thank you, George. And following on from that, we've had a question emailed into us by Chris. And he says that he would be concerned if there was a one-state solution, that the Arab citizens of the new state would be subject to persecution with even less chance of self-determination. And he asked, would the two-state solution using the 1949 borders be the best solution? And he also thinks the Arab League should be able to back the nation financially and militarily if needs be. And he wants to get your thoughts on this.
Well, first of all, the Arab League is not even in the Vauxhall Conference division. The Arab League, as I always say, the Arabs have got a league, who knew? Please don't build any castles on the shifting sands of the Arab League. Secondly, if my auntie had balls, she'd be my uncle. There is absolutely no possibility whatsoever of Israel evacuating all the territory it has held since 1948. It's pie in the sky. That would require them to evacuate East Jerusalem, evacuate the Beverly Hills settlements of the West Bank, and undo all their Jews-only roads, and undo the annexation of the Jordan Valley, which is about to happen perhaps as early as tomorrow. There is absolutely no possibility of that happening. And therefore, to struggle for it, it's a bit like staying in the Labour Party to struggle for socialism. It's not going to happen. So why not adopt the democratic case? That all the people living in Israel, Palestine, must be equal citizens. They must all have a vote. They must all have the same rights. They must all live under the same law and the same constitution as equals. That's a far better banner to fly, isn't it? That's what I think anyway.
Thanks, George. And another question emailed in from Daniel Watson. How can the Workers' Party of Britain inform the British public on the atrocities of Israel without the mainstream media labelling the party anti-Semitic? How can the Workers' Party present the real facts without distortion from our mainstream media?
You probably can't, as has been demonstrated ever since Shulamit Aloni told me it's a trick, we always do it. I have been being accused of being anti-Semitic, but I'm not. Not a scintilla of my being is anti-Semitic. As a matter of fact, I love Jews. I just hate Netanyahu and the ideology that he represents. As I told you earlier, I used to regularly live with Israelis, very close friends of mine, in Shankin Street in Tel Aviv. I am not. How could someone like me, as influenced by me, by Karl Marx, with a shelf full of Bob Dylan music and books and Chomsky books and so on. It's an absurd allegation. How could people like us be anti-Semitic? So we reject this and move on. As I said to you earlier, though, the Workers' Party is not going to fetishize this question. We are frankly more concerned with the pensioners dying in our own care homes, because we can directly affect that. That's our business, most directly. It's our government that are killing our pensioners. And we are British, and we have votes in Britain and voices in Britain. So don't imagine that I'm going to be talking to you on Palestine every other week. I'm not.
Thanks, George. And next question comes from Darren. Go ahead, Darren. Oh, sorry, just having
Can't hear you, Darren.
Unmuting you there.
I'm unmuted. You hear me now?
Yes, Darren, yes.
Oh, George, good to meet you. Israel seems to like to do a lot of talking. It appears to be that they want to do a lot of talking to buy time, a lot of time, in order to gain all the Palestinian lands. So what's to stop them carrying on with this process of just talking?
Well, they did used to talk. They used to say there was a peace process. And Arafat used to say it's an endless process, but no peace. But as a matter of fact, they've given up that affectation. They're no longer talking to anyone. There's no pretense that there's a peace process now. There's no pretense that all they're waiting for is somebody to talk to. So actually they believe in fait accompli. And that's why tomorrow, if I'm any judge, they will annex the entirety of the Jordan Valley, which is, I think, fully 20% of what was supposed to be the Palestinian state, maybe more in terms of area. So they're no longer doing any talking, they just act. They acted when they illegally annexed the Golan Heights. They acted when they illegally annexed East Jerusalem, and they will act this week, I'm sure, in illegally annexing Jordan. So what can we do? Not much. We are a small socialist party in Britain. It would be wrong to exaggerate what we can do. We can only tell people what we stand for and argue as cleverly as it's possible to do the reasons why we stand for that. But in the end, we cannot liberate Palestine. We can't liberate anywhere. Let's start trying to liberate our own country first.
Thanks, George. And next question comes from Gavin Dobson. Go ahead, Gavin.
Hi, George. How are you doing? You all right?
Yes, good. Thanks, Gav.
Yes, question for you. When I was at school, we thought about the British Empire history, but I believe we never thought about the brutality in imperialism. My question is, why is this, George?
Well, I once came home to my Irish grandfather, God rest his soul, and told him that the teacher had said that the British Empire was so vast that upon it the sun never set. And my grandfather said, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark. And I never had any cause to doubt his wisdom on that. Our curriculum, I know this because, as a matter of fact, my eldest grandchild, my grandson, Sean, is a history buff. And so he comes back and seeks an alternative point of view from me to that which he is taught in school. I know just how utterly bereft of truth the British curriculum in history really is. There's endless lessons about the supposed killings of Stalin and the Soviet Union, but there's nothing about the far, far, far greater killings of the British Empire. Even in Ireland, just a few miles away, never mind in India and Africa and in the Middle East and all the other places that we once ruled. So we live in the society we live in, and we have to encourage our own children and our own members to understand better, to question more, as RT puts it. And slowly we'll get there. I've got to say this, Gavin. I've lived a long time. It's true that the majority of our citizens do not yet know the truth. But it's also true that a larger number of our citizens do know the truth than have ever done before. And that's because of the revolutionary tools that we now have at our disposal, including this one, in which I'm talking with you now.
Thanks, George. And next question comes from Ian. Go ahead, Ian.
Evening, George. Evening, comrades.
Evening, Ian. Evening.
All right. Yeah, I was just wondering, I've never knowingly bought Israeli products. So what should we be looking out for when it comes to avoiding their exports? And also, I'd just like to say your granddad sounded like a great fella.
Thank you very much. He was. He was a devout Catholic, an Irish Republican, a communist, and a soldier in Montgomery's 8th Army all at the same time. So you can say that he covered all bases. the BDS outfits, organizations have a very extensive list of goods and services that should be boycotted. And if we are in trade unions, if we are in churches, if we are in local authorities that have funds that they invest, we should be struggling for the divestment of those funds from Israel and from Israeli profit centers. But the BDS, just Google it. You'll find a list as long as your arm. It's not always easy, and it's sometimes not possible to boycott everything. And to an extent, the more items you have on a boycott list, the less successful that boycotting is going to do. I was once in the middle of a famine in Eritrea, Ethiopia, on the border with Sudan, in darkness, desperate for a drink, and I drank from a filthy container and a filthy bottle, a bottle of Vimto, which I had hated all of my life, but it was the Vimto or nothing. And that can happen in boycotts. We shouldn't, as I say, make a fetish of these things. Our individual purchase of one item is not the important thing. But if we can build a mass awareness of avoiding the most obvious Israeli products, we'll be making a contribution. During the struggle against South Africa, we used to go into shops and buy up as many South African, or gather into our basket as many South African products as we could. And then when we got to the checkout, we would ostentatiously notice that these oranges, these cucumbers, this were South African. Oh my God, and toss them out of our basket and walk out of the store, leaving them. We can all do that. It's a good tactic.
Thanks, George. Next question comes from Lucy. Go ahead, Lucy.
Oh, hello. Hello, George.
Hello, Lucy. Hello.
Hello.
What a lovely place.
I did have a question. I've used the virtual background you can have on this Zoom thing. That's an old photograph. Yeah. Thank you. So my question I had has already been answered by you, but how to, on boycotting, what can we do to, protest or do? I mean, really, it's down to governments more than the individual. But if there's anything that we can do, what?
Well, one of the things I pioneered back in 1980, for example, I twinned our city of Dundee with the Palestinian city of Nablus. And our town hall became the first public building in the Western world to fly the Palestinian flag from the town hall. And it's still flying now, by the way, 40 years later. And all kinds of civil society links were then built on that between churches and unions and schools and universities and so on with the town of Nablus and its people. We can all struggle for that. We can, and there are actually now, I was also involved in the twinning of Glasgow with Bethlehem when I was a Glasgow MP, and people can do that. They can raise that demand in their civil society organizations, in their union branches, and so on. But even short of that, it's not hard to find the contacts of Palestinian organizations and institutions in the occupied land that we can link up with and showcase their goods. When we see Palestinian dates on sale, we should buy them. When we see Palestinian olive oil and kafirs and so on sale, we should buy them. And we should try to reach out so that at the very least they know that there are people in Britain who are thinking of them and who support them. You'd be surprised how moved and touched people are by such small gestures.
Thanks, George. And one question from Stephen. Go ahead, Stephen.
Hi, George. Can you hear me?
Very clearly, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that the demographics of the region will favour the Palestinian cause in the future? And also what looks like the decline of the American empire?
I do, yes. As the United States fades as a power, the military power of Israel will not be lessened because it's a nuclear-armed superpower in its own right now. But the economic subvention from the United States, which is really significant. I mean, it's roughly $1 billion a year for a country of 7 million people, on top of virtually unlimited and almost always entirely free military hardware, and then the same amount again from fundraising, independent individual fundraising by Zionist organizations in the United States. As that all begins to dwindle, as it will, as the United States fades and as political consciousness about the justice of all of this rises, and as I already indicated it is doing, amongst the American population in general, but perhaps specifically amongst young Jewish Americans, all of that is bound to change. And the Palestinian population is not going to shrink, it's going to grow. And so the 50-50 that exists today is not going to get any more in Israel's interests. So yes, I think the march of time and birth rate and the decline of the American empire will all be significant. I'm bound to tell you, though, I'm not expecting any of this to happen in my own lifetime, and as I look at you on the screen, probably not in yours either, but perhaps in the time of our children, there will be a free people in Palestine.
Thanks, George. And one last question written into us by Margaret. The right wing seems to have been gaining ground recently in Israel. For example, Netanyahu being voted in for a fourth term, and right wing parties and their racist rhetoric seem to be more popular than ever in Israel. Do you think this will change in future?
I don't, I'm sorry to say, and expecting the Israelis to correct their own society is a bit like asking a surgeon to operate on his own foot. It's not going to be a successful strategy. There will continue to be brave people in Israel, and they will continue to protest and do what they can to come to the aid of the people that are being subjugated there, but I don't expect that will statistically grow. But this process long predates Netanyahu. It's been more than 40 years since, let me put it another way. When I first started in this, Israel used to pretend to be a socialist country. I'm not making that up. The Israeli government was in the Socialist International. The Israeli trade union movement, the Histadrut, was highly significant in the World Trade Union Forum. People would talk about kibbutz as being socialist enterprises, to which the answer was the kibbutz is to socialism as a gang of thieves agreeing to share their loot equally. The pretense, though, was that the Israeli Labour Party was in charge of a left-wing country, even though they were at the time openly militarily cooperating with apartheid South Africa, including in the making of nuclear weapons. They were openly associated with fascist generalissimos and juntas in Latin America. They still claimed to be a socialist country, but nobody in their right mind would claim that now. The reality is that since the election of the Prime Minister and former terrorist leader Menachem Begin in I think 1980, but certainly if not 40 years ago, then almost 40 years ago, Israeli governments have marched ineluctably to the right. And now you could not get much more right. Benny Gantz, the man who carried out the massacres in Gaza, is the opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu. And nothing says irredeemable like a polarity between Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu. Not two cheeks of the same arse, but twin killers, twin murderers are competing for the reins of power in Israel, and nobody else is anywhere at all. So don't expect political change in Israel, but follow the good people that are not just nameless people on the streets, but those writers like Ilan Pappé, like Avi Schleim, like those who are still clinging to little footholds in newspapers like Haaretz and so on, who continue to cry out and support them and admire them, for they are truly heroes.
Thank you, George. And one last question from Fran quickly before we close.
You're right, George. I just wanted to say, people have been asking what we can do as a party about Palestine, is just to remember that Palestine is a state and tell other people that it's a state. That should be like our bottom line, our starting point in all this as a party, really. And that's all I really wanted to say, just to everybody watching and all our members. Just remember that the place exists.
Yes, as long as Palestine resists, it will continue to exist. I was with President Arafat from the summer of 1977 until his death. I was there at the hospital when he passed away. And he used to say, slightly politically incorrectly, "We are not the Red Indians. We refuse to go into the museum of X nations." And he did achieve that, because if not for Arafat and the struggle that he led, the Palestinians would now be in the museum, and we would go and see their clothes and their artifacts and study them as an ex-people. But the Palestinians continue to resist, and therefore they continue to exist, and therefore they deserve our support. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for watching. And don't forget, there's another Workers' Party meeting for members only tomorrow night. And don't forget Sputnik on Saturday and the mother of all talk shows on Sunday. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Dan. Bye.
Thanks, George. Good evening, everyone.
All the best.